Greetings to all, and welcome to the podcast of Jewish Ideas. What is Hasidism? We've all seen Hasidic Jews on the streets and on our screens, and we may be familiar with some of their practices and customs. But what of the belief system underpinning this Jewish sect? What were the philosophical or religious principles in which the early Hasidic movement grounded themselves? In other words, taken as a system of ideas, what is Hasidism? To discuss this topic, we are privileged to be joined today by Professor Ariel Mayse of the Department of Religion at Stanford University. He holds a Ph.D. in Jewish Studies from Harvard University and rabbinic ordination from Beit Midrash Har'el in Israel. He is the editor and co-editor of numerous books on Hasidism and is the author of Speaking Infinities, God and Language in the Teachings of Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezrich. He is a noted scholar of early Hasidut, and we are most fortunate to have him with us today to discuss our topic. Professor Mayse, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Fantastic. Okay, we are very excited for our conversation today. Very briefly, I'm going to spend a minute outlining what one reads in history books of the Hasidic movement before I ask about the ideas underpinning this. So if you open Wikipedia or open your average history book, you'll see something like this, which is that during the late 18th century, we begin to see a religious movement flourish or appear in the eastern part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. We see charismatic figures such as Dov Ber or the Maggid of Mezrich, Elimelech of Lezhensk, Yaakov Yosef of Polon, and others, establishing their own communities of adherents. They claim to be teaching the ideas or elaborating on the ideas of a mystic from the previous century, Israel ben Eliezer, otherwise known as the Baal Shem Tov, and their communities are quite simply different. Their teachings are different, the form and style of prayer are different, their customs are different, their religious aspirations are different, their model of religious leadership seems to be different, and due to this they arouse a fair amount of opposition. These Hasidic communities eventually separated and proliferated into several different courts, and they became semi-independent communities of their own and remain with us in some sort of similar form to this very day. So this much can be gleaned from any history book, and Professor, please tell me if I've gone wrong on any of these very rudimentary details. But what I'm interested in, and the major question which I'm going to pose now and will hopefully accompany us over the course of our conversation, is what were the major ideas of early Hasidism? What were the great intellectual innovations or underpinnings of this movement in the late 18th, early 19th century?
Great question, JJ. Thank you so much. There's a lot of Hasidism which is new. There's a lot in Hasidism which is old. And, we have this great phrase in Hebrew or Aramaic, which is something can be old, new. It can be milin chadatin atikin. Something can be old and new at the same time. And I think that really befits Hasidism. Hasidism is backwards compatible, to use the words of Zalman Schachter Shalomi, in that it takes things that people know. Sometimes it takes practices, or it takes rituals or the classical mitzvot and tweaks them slightly, but by and large, it's, to borrow a phrase from Nietzsche, a transvaluation. It is a revision of the way that people think about the meaning of religious life. So it's not just about what length of coats does one wear or how long are one's payas, but it's about why one does what one does and how one is in the world. So the major ideas of Hasidism are well known, and of course you've pointed out several of them, more the social dimensions, the idea of a charismatic leader as the central authority, the tzaddik, the holy person, or the rebbe as the kind of nucleus of the Hasidic cell. That for sure is an important development, and there are some scholars who have kind of identified the tzaddik as both the central innovation or the only innovation of Hasidism, and there are also some who have said that it is the key to the decline of Hasidism, which I think we'll get to a little bit later. I agree that it's critical and central and crucial and important. It's also not the only novum, the only chidush of Hasidism. But again, I say chidush with a footnote that everything can be found in earlier sources, or many of the things. And I don't mean to downplay the innovative nature of Hasidism, but I think that needs to be underscored as well. Key to Hasidism is a religious ethos that embraces joy as a fundament, simcha as a fundament of religious living, rather than guilt or a kind of moroseness or a kind of abstemious pietism that was common in Eastern Europe in the 18th century, Hasidism emphasizes a sense of joy, jubilation, uplift, optimism, and enamorment with religious living. This is visible in almost every one of the teachings that can be, if not authentically traced back to the purported founder of Hasidism. They're there in the cluster of teachings that surround his memory. So that's joy. Presence in what one does is another key. Whatever one is doing can be transformed into a religious action through intention. The word there, kavanah, can turn everything from painting a wagon wheel or installing a hardwood floor, as I've been spending a lot of my time with these days, or reading a book, or reading the Talmud, or having an ordinary conversation with an ordinary person. These are all transformed into encounters with God when they are approached with intention. And of course, that's true also of all the classical mitzvot as well. Prayer in Hasidism is uplifted to a new place of centrality. Prayer has always been important. Prayer has always been key to religious life, according to Judaism, but there's a tension between prayer and Talmud Torah as to which of them is the sort of the great pillar upon which Judaism stands. And Hasidism doesn't diminish the centrality of Torah study, although it transforms it in a certain sense, decouples it from an exclusive focus on the Talmud. And Hasidism uplifts prayer as a moment of awakening, as a moment of embodied encounter with the divine, one in which the voice of God and the voice of the human being become interwoven one with the other. So this is another key development of Hasidism. Theologically, the notion that God is everywhere, as one early source puts it, als is Gott, Melo chol haaretz kavodo, the world is filled with divinity. The Hasidic teachers ask us to look at the world as radiating or shimmering with divinity, which is the key to understanding why God can be accessed in all moments and in all actions. But it's also a kind of posture through which one sees that the world is not devoid of divinity, as some would have it, but the world is kind of overflowing with a divine immanence that if one can simply attune oneself to that reality, one can see that the world is filled with sparks of divine light.
So this is fascinating, and I'd like to touch on the last point of radiating divinity and immanence, which is, can such a concept be traced further backwards? In other words, there's a tremendous focus upon it in early Hasidism, but is this... to what extent is this actually an innovation? Are they relying on prior Jewish sources? Because, arguably there are earlier Jewish sources which seem to state this. So was this simply an elaboration on it, or was there something qualitatively new about the Hasidic take on divine immanence?
Pantheism is often described as a kind of monstrosity. It's something that both religious and then eventually secular thinkers struggle with. The 18th century is a time of great controversy over pantheism in Western Europe. To be accused of being a Spinozist or being a pantheist was kind of the kiss of death in one's philosophical journey. On the other hand, it's certainly true that if you trace this back to the debates in the 16th century, most people discuss Hasidic understandings of pantheism in the context of the Safed Tzfat revival in the 16th century and the teachings of Rabbi Isaac Luria on Tzimtzum, or the contraction of divinity, or the focusing of divinity. The word Tzimtzum can mean both of those things, the withdrawal or the evacuation of divinity from the cosmos, or the focusing of divinity into the cosmos, and then the Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. It's important also to note, and Yoni Garb in a recent book has actually made this case quite convincingly, to note that there is a very important addition here, although it's a premonition, that comes from Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, also in the 16th century. Garb points out that if for Luria, Tzimtzum, rupture, breaking, these are the sort of, axioms of religious of religious thinking. For Moshe Cordovero, it is connectivity. It is that everything is connected one with the other. And he gets this from the Zohar. The Zohar's own way of seeing everything in the physical world is connected to the spiritual, and everything in the spiritual is having physical manifestations. That's true of God. That's true of all aspects of the cosmos that are, again, filled with this kind of divinity. There, the Zohar tells it in mythic terms that rarely get into what we would think of in terms of pantheism. So there are anticipations of it there. There are anticipations of Hasidic pantheism in the 16th century. Moshe Cordovero is fairly forthright in his declarations that there is no place devoid of divinity, and that when we eat and we drink, we are turning those things into sacraments, those actions into sacraments, through preparing our consciousness. On the other hand, like so many things in Hasidism, the fact that it can be footnoted to other sources doesn't explain why it was so important in the 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st centuries, because something happens when that is set into the idiom of action through a kind of ritualization in which all things can be brought to bear, and in which, for Cordovero, this is a very complicated a very complicated theological system in which the relationship in between the divine vessels and the divine essence are, you kind of work it out, and it's hard to figure out. And he reads with the eyes of a philosopher, although he is certainly alert to the power of myth. In Hasidism, this is distilled down to a kind of devotional truth, not one that is simplified, but one that is presented in a form in which it is electrifying in its clarity, again, even though it's not simplistic.
To complicate this a little bit, and you described a system of ideas and certainly immanence which all seem to be present or seem to be emphasized or elaborated upon during the early decades of Hasidism. But the early decades of Hasidism had several different, I would say, major religious and intellectual personalities. I mentioned some of them, of Mezrich and Elimelech of Lezhensk and Shneur Zalman of Liadi, etc., etc. To what extent can all these figures be, or let me put it a different way, to what extent was there intellectual diversity among this early cadre of Hasidic masters? Because there seems to have been, and as you're describing, a core of ideas, but presumably figures such as themselves would take it in somewhat different directions.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything called Hasidism in the 18th century, at least not until the 1780s. 1790s. Before then, there's a cluster of teachings. Not everyone has the same ones, and a cluster of stories, and not everyone has the same ones, that surround this figure who was known to many of the figures that we understand at the heart of early Hasidism. Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, who you mentioned, who scholars used to debate he did live, he didn't live, and then Moshe Rossman dug up his tax record. So we know that he did live, and we know where he lived, and we kind of know what he did for a living, and we know that he wasn't a countercultural figure at the margins. So we know what the Baal Shem Tov does for a living, and we know what he does in the town of Mezhibozh. He's hired there as a healer and as a holy person. It's fair to say that he becomes a kind of, the word in Latin, pater familias, a sort of like sacred father figure at the heart of early Hasidism, means that everyone has a different memory about what his core teachings were. Some of the teachers met him only once or twice. Many of them had no immediate memory of meeting him. Those who were the disciples of Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezrich may never have met the Baal Shem Tov, or if they had, they met him only once. On the one hand, you might say that the roots of Hasidism, let's think with the tree metaphor as it's commonly portrayed, really are there in the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. There is really one kind of fuzzy constellation of teachings that really is associated with him. But again, different people got different things from him. There's no chain of transmission of a particular kind of centralized leadership, as once was assumed and is common in Hasidic hagiography, where there was the Baal Shem Tov, and then there's the Maggid of Mezrich, and then there's everyone else who comes after. There are competing visions, as as to what becomes Hasidism in the time of the Baal Shem Tov, in the time of his immediate students, and certainly after that in the time of those who are of the so-called third generation. There are many different Hasidic paths, and you begin to find Hasidic thinkers in the late 18th and early 19th century reflect on this fact. And they ask themselves, how can it be that we're all, as it were, translations of this message of the Baal Shem Tov? And how can it be that this teacher emphasizes prayer, and this teacher emphasizes a particular kind of learning, and this teacher emphasizes tzedakah, or this teacher emphasizes a kind of intellectualism? And there are great debates that happen. There is a lot up for grabs in trying to understand what indeed is the religious legacy of these early teachers. And I think of it kind of like a polyphonic chorus in which if you have a good sound system, you can isolate different voices. And if you listen with sensitivity, you can hear that there are different voices that are all being woven together. And we should resist the temptation to homogenize. Everything in Hasidism says the same thing. But we should probably also resist the temptation to draw distinctions where there's no difference, in the sense that this is really a shared intellectual project.
Fascinating. It's funny you say that. A few times I've heard Hasidic adherents of one form or another say the phrase Hasidus says. As the Hasidus says, or Hasidus teaches, and I've always, my eyebrows always jumped when I hear something like that. But you mentioned something along the lines that until about the 1790s, Hasidism is not to be considered one homogenized thing, and one ought to be wary of that. So, what happened then to make it so? Was it simply, you described just before, a process of self-reflection, that teachers of, let's say, the third generation or something like that began to reflect on their movement as a movement in and of itself, or as something separate, something coherent in and of itself? Is that what makes Hasidism an ism, an entity in and of itself?
Yeah, the phrase Hasidism says is almost as ludicrous as the Talmud says, or Judaism says. There are so many different voices within the Hasidic lexicon or the Hasidic canon. Usually what Hasidus means is my Hasidic tradition says this, in the same way that Judaism says is my particular interpretation of Judaism happens to say this, or the voice from the rabbinic canon that I'm choosing to lift up at the moment. So you're right to raise your eyebrows, although attentive listening to such things tells you something at least about the person who is standing in front of you. How does Hasidism come to be an ism or an ideology? Again, the roots are there in the early teachings attributed to the Baal Shem Tov and attributed to the figures around him in that loose-knit circle of disciples and in that next generation also. Hasidism coheres as a socio-religious movement because of a number of different factors. One of them has to do with the spread of these teachings to many different communities all throughout White Russia, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, in which different teachers are taking forward and carrying forward different ideas and creating new devotional paths. They're in contact with one another by means of letters, and they're often interwoven by means of family arrangements, even if they are by and large totally independent of one another. The critical moments, you might say, are the conflict with the Mitnagdim, the so-called Mitnagdim, or the opponents of Hasidism, these conflicts begin in the 1770s. In 1772, the first anti-Hasidic bans are proclamated, and even though they are admittedly, that is to say, by their own admission, totally toothless, they are attempts to eradicate and to stamp out the heresy of Hasidism that's described as a kind of, as it were, neo-Sabbateanism that has reared its ugly head once more in Podolia and Volynia, these regions of Eastern Europe. You might say, and Ada Rappaport Albert, Alea Hashalom, who was a great scholar of Hasidism, makes this point, you might say that Hasidism comes into being because its opponents force it to do so. They force it to clarify its ideology. They force them to get into communication with each other, and perhaps there are even, if the letters are to be believed, there are kind of mini conferences to try and figure out what do we do now that we are raising so much trouble. The Vilna Gaon, who is a signatory at least on one of these documents, lends his weight and his gravitas to that persecution. So throughout the 1770s and 80s and 90s, I think we should call it a process. The founding of Hasidism happens in those decades. And by the 1790s, the early 1800s, there really is a sense, not only here do we see ourselves as linked to the memory of the Baal Shem Tov, we see ourselves as distinct from other Hasidic groups. We see each other, and as a whole, as distinct from other Jewish groups in the early 1800s. The Hasidic community, or let's say the fuzzy-edged Hasidic community in which membership is totally opaque and all those caveats, know what's happening in Western Europe already in the 1770s and 80s. Parts of Modestus Mendelssohn's writings begin to circulate already at that time. And the Hasidic teachers are not pleased. They don't like what they hear. And they describe it as a kind of heresy. And this is particularly true in Galicia and in the sort of the regions that are bordering on Western Europe and Central Europe. And at that time, you begin to see what will emerge with greater vehemence in the early 1800s, which is Hasidism as a kind of religious orthodoxy with a capital O. As Jewish orthodoxy gets up and running at that time, orthodoxy there understood as contra-reform, with a lowercase r at that point, but certainly being against any capitulations to Judaism as a religion that can function within the modern nation state as it's meant to be understood by people like Mendelssohn. The idea that religious transformation at the hands of internal or external reforms is a greater enemy to traditional Judaism than anything else, to a certain degree unites the Hasidim with their former opponents, the Mitnagdim, but it certainly unites the Hasidim together such that they see themselves increasingly throughout the 19th century as the kind of spearhead at the head of the lance that is meant to stave off the modernization of Judaism. So this, too, is a very important part of the story of Hasidism and Hasidism's self-becoming as a religious movement.
That's fascinating. There was a lot there, and I want to ask on a few different points of it. So firstly, very quickly, you said the phrase, the heresy of Hasidism, that it was viewed as heretical, as some sort of terrible breach by its opponents, specifically its opponents within the Orthodox world. We'll get to the Haskalah in a moment, which is my favorite topic to talk about. So why exactly, or put it otherwise, what were the Hasidim accused of? What was their heresy supposed to be? It seems, at least looking at it from 21st century viewpoint, Hasidism became, as you say, the tip of the spear of what was considered then orthodoxy as the fight against modernizing trends. But at the start, what exactly was the heresy that they were accused of harboring?
I don't think orthodoxy is the right word, if you'll allow me. Okay. In the 18th century, the Jewish community in the 18th and early 19th century is really undergoing, in Eastern Europe, undergoing a transformation of shifting from tradition to traditionalism, and moving from a tradition with a community with a thick tradition, and sort of Max Weber's understanding of a tradition that is passed on from family to family and through communities and through the many normative shades of the way that rituals are practiced. In the 19th century, that's begun to totter. It's begun a little bit wobbly, and that increasingly so in the wake of the Napoleonic conquests and the real utter transformation of all kinds of life in Eastern Europe.
with Hasidism, at least according to Jacob Katz and others, being a factor in this, being a factor in the undermining of what he called the traditional society, to a degree, unless you don't agree with that.
I think you're hard-pressed to identify Hasidism as a destabilizing force, because I think Hasidism is responding to many of the conditions of modernity. And the idea that Hasidism is a modern phenomenon is only because it is dialectically locked with the opposition of secularization or secularism as an ideology, I think is not helpful. Hasidism is a form of modern Judaism in the same way that the Haskalah is a form of modern Judaism. And does it destabilize the family as was once assumed? No, I don't think so. None of the sociological records have shown that. Does it destabilize Jewish tradition? No, I don't think that. Also, in that the places that become Hasidic or were Hasidic are often those that incline most toward a kind of ideology of traditionalism. This is true all throughout Eastern Europe. So I think it's actually more helpful to understand Hasidism as a kind of modern phenomenon, which is also trying to make sense, especially in the late 18th century, trying to make sense of a world that is shifting, enlarging, and transforming in rapid and in some ways unprecedented ways.
So I was going to cut in because I think this is an appropriate point to ask about the relationship between Hasidut and the Haskalah, which you brought up already. And it seems to be fascinating, the point that you brought up, specifically, and again, not many traditional exponents or those who discuss Hasidism would view Hasidism as a modern phenomenon, as a response to modern trends to a certain degree. And therefore, it's fascinating to note that Hasidism and Haskalah arose more or less simultaneously. In terms of the temporal affinities, both of them really taking shape in, let's say, the 1780s, 1790s. Of course, Hasidism in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was soon to be broken up and eaten up by the rest of the European empires, and the Haskalah, of course, coalescing mainly in Berlin and Königsberg in the Germanic states. But I would say, so there are obvious differences between the two. And the Hasidism does become, as you say, a very, perhaps orthodox, very, very traditionalist way of conceiving of Judaism, whereas, of course, the Haskalah tends towards modernization. But, okay, aside from these differences, could they be seen to be very similar in certain ways? Or do their similarities end with the fact that they perceive modern trends and react to them? Are there any deeper affinities that they have, aside from the fact that they simply occur simultaneously?
I understand one element of Moses Mendelssohn's theological project to be a rich and robust reaccounting for the commandments, a way of rethinking the nature of Jewish praxis, not so much from a perspective of the details of halakha psuka, but more from the perspective of what we call ta'amei hamitzvot, of accounting for or reasons for the commandments. And trying to find reasons for the commandments is an old Jewish preoccupation. There, the Talmud says you should do it and you shouldn't do it. And we have ambivalence toward that in ways that extend all the way from the biblical period all the way into the 21st century. But one of the great elements of medieval Kabbalah is it really seizes hold of the commandments and imbues them with tremendous meaning. God is in need of human action, and each one of the commandments fulfills that divine need in a different kind of way. And all the details really, really matter. And in fact, they matter so much that if you don't do them correctly, the world can collapse.
A notion that would make the heart of any rationalist flutter and the eyebrows bounce with indignation, no doubt.
No doubt. And in a sense, it's a response to rationalism. In a sense, it's a response to the Maimonidean project in which there is an instrumentalist reading of the commandments as a means to an end, a necessary means to an end, and yet there's at least a a dream of beyond the commandments if one has attained certain kinds of perfection. The famous passage from Maimonides that is often quoted in this, and it's complicated to know what he does or he doesn't mean, from his commentary on the Mishnah in Makot, where he says you only need to do one commandment if you do it really correctly, be'ahava ulishma, and with a sense of love and reverence and for its own sake, then you can attain the world to come. You would never catch a medieval Kabbalist saying such a thing, because every one of the commandments, even the ones that we don't need or don't practice at present, fulfills that divine need and also transforms the individual, and the cosmos rides upon all of them. And in fact, the idea that, like, for what Maimonides, why does God choose one sheep here and two sheep here? Because God had to choose one number, so why not choose those numbers? For the Kabbalists, there's tremendous meaning in all of those. What's amazing that you find in Hasidism is that it takes the Maimonidean position against the Kabbalists and says all the commandments really lead to the same thing. They lead to Dveikut. And so what they are trying to do is to grapple with this Kabbalistic legacy of the mitzvot given for a divine need, and yet everything collapses or flattens. The distinction between them are effaced, such that all the commandments lead to the same place. In a certain sense, Hasidism and Mendelssohn are grappling with the meaning and the nature of religious practice, the relationship between mind and body, the relationship between affect and experience, the relationship between theology and action. These are very much at the forefront of both of their projects. In a certain way, Mendelssohn fails. Beautiful as his writing is, in a certain way, Hasidism succeeds in a remarkable sense. And I'm truly fascinated by the way in which that dynamic happens.
So, Professor, what you just said here is a revelation, okay? At least to me. This notion that the Hasidic attitude towards the mitzvah, towards the commandments, takes, in a certain fundamental way, takes the side of, let's say, the Maimonidean rationalistic position against the earlier Kabbalistic position, because generally, I mean, one finds that even today, when Hasidim are about to perform a certain mitzvah, they will preface it with something like a short prayer announcing their intentions to perform a theurgic, Kabbalistic act of uniting the different sphera, the different divine stages of emanation, and that is something that they see as an outcome of their practice of mitzvah. But what you seem to be saying is that, yes, but that is a means to an end, the ultimate end being what you call dveikut, and that is the notion of mitzvah being means to another ultimate end is actually much closer to the Maimonidean and Mendelssohnian way of that is mind blowing. I will chew on that and put that in my pipe and smoke it for a long time. Okay, yeah, go on.
One more note on that. The Kabbalistic traditions continue in Hasidism in their more detail-oriented form amongst the Hasidic elites. In certain Hasidic schools, there's much more emphasis on the particulars of Kabbalah. You find this in the schools of Zidichov and Kamarna in the 19th century. But they're a minority, I would say, amongst the great Hasidic world in which the devotional element of kavanah, intention rather than kavanot, these kind of intricate Lurianic formulae is much more important. So it's not just contra the early Kabbalistic perspective, it's actually contra the later Kabbalistic perspective. They've breached with the incredible complexity of the Lurianic kavanot, the Lurianic intentions, which by that point had become very, very complicated in the 18th century. They use the language of Lurianic Kabbalah. They know that there's something deep there. There's a cultural hunger for that, because it's sometimes argued that Lurianic Kabbalah has kind of collapsed in the 18th century. And it's true that Lurianic Kabbalah is really complicated by that point, and that Moshe Cordovero is also very popular in Eastern Europe. It's not the only thing that they were reading, Lurianic Kabbalah. On the other hand, they're printing Lurianic Kabbalistic books in the 18th century like there's no tomorrow. This is the first time that it's really hit like mass market paperbacks, as it were. So there is something really interesting happening with Lurianic Kabbalah, but they're taking parts of it and they're mobilizing it in an interesting way that requires, I think, careful insight and nuance. And by the way, the Baal Shem Tov is trying to the Baal Shem Tov and those who come after him is trying to justify why one needs to perform all these different rituals, given that there's only one great religious truth, Melo Chol Haaretz Kvodo. Mendelssohn is trying to figure out in a different way, why do I need these particular, and I use that word in the sense of like particularistic, rituals, given that there are these grand universal philosophical truths? Why should I still do this and that when there are these kind of, if unstable in the sense of, humanity is constantly trying to rework its philosophical positions and we're moving toward a greater understanding. He has a kind of flexible theology. He understands what the ceremonial script of Judaism, that's his phrase, the ceremonial script of Judaism, is that it points us in many different ways to these kinds of philosophical truths. If you kind of translate that into Hebrew and into Kabbalistic language, there is a really interesting resonance in between that and the teachings of early Hasidism, of all of the mitzvot pointing toward a state that is both deeply personal, a kind of religious awakening of heart, body, and mind, but is also theurgic. My deveikut is not just me having this great religious experience, it's me melting into the fabric of the cosmos without surrendering my individuated identity, at least not forever, while also repairing part of that great fractured story, of that great fractured divine story, which is what religious living is all about. So the theurgic and the devotional come together.
This is especially fascinating because this portrayal of Hasidut does jive to a large degree with a tendency or a thrust among Jewish intellectuals in the late medieval period of trying to syncretize both rationalistic philosophy and Kabbalah. You have figures like Avraham Abulafia, who writes 3 different pirushim on the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim, and other figures who try and essentially see those two seemingly very divergent systems as teaching the same truths using different symbolic or metaphorical frameworks. And this seems to be another sort of act of syncretism, which I will definitely have to sort of reflect on. This is very interesting. I want to divert the conversation a little bit. I'll ask about 1 or 2 specific facets of Hasidism during its early phase. One of them is in terms of its biblical exegesis. One of the facets, particular Hasidic facets, which is most well known among Jews who still study the canonical Jewish text, is that Hasidic masters and books seem to have their own style of biblical exegesis, their own way of reading and parsing verses, and their own way of extricating teachings from biblical verses. Could you perhaps describe what that way is? Is this an innovation? And how would one describe this?
There are many different kinds of Hasidic literature. There are letters, there are stories, there are theological treatises that are written as books, there are hanhagot, regimen vitae, prescriptive practices that one ought to do. But really at the heart of Hasidism is this kind of homiletical literature, and homiletical literature, it might come as no surprise, is about homiletics. And it's about the way in which ancient texts pop when they're brought to life through this kind of interpretation. And this obviously is kind of what Jews do. When Michael Fishbane, the great scholar of Jewish interpretive thinking, writes that Jewish theology is an interpretive theology and that, like Gadamer says, we are constantly reinterpreting the past in the present in order to create the future. This is how Jews do theology, whether that's through the Pshat, Remez, Drash, Sod, fourfold structure, or other ways. We delight in finding ways to connect that which we see in the world around us, and that which we see within us, and that which we see in God through the text, and we see the world around us and ourselves and God through the mirror of the text. And it's a complicated sort of two-way street. Hasidism, it must be remembered, is driven forward by a kind of oral culture. It's oral and written at the same time. Hasidic sources circulate in writing already in the 1770s, but the oral event of going to the teacher to hear words of Torah spoken, it's a kind of revelation as it's understood in the Hasidic in the Hasidic culture, it really is the kind of, you might say it's like the throbbing heart of public-facing Hasidism. Public-facing Hasidism in the sense of not the private domain of the individual, but its communal dimension is really about listening to that kind of interpretive moment. So is that new? Yes and no. There's this great line.
There seems to be a theme in your answers, Professor.
Yeah.
New and not new.
I always tell my students, Judaism is the yes and story rather than the no story. It's the yes and. So the Kabbalists, looking at Maimonides, can say, Ein lo guf, ein lo dmuta guf, God has no body or even a semblance of the body, and yet here is lots of lines about God's head, or here's the dew that trickles down God's beard, or the 300, descriptions of the wrinkles on the divine forehead, etc., that we have in the Idras. So the yes and dimension of this is I think it's in Bamidbar Rabbah, where it's the late Midrash, it's Midrash, and the Midrash says about itself that it is the panim sochakot of Torah, that it's the smiling, playful face of Torah. And that's definitely what Hasidism is doing. It is a kind of smiling, not irreverent, but deeply reverent kind of exegesis. One of my teachers, Malila Helner-Eshet, has this beautiful description of interpretation in Zoharic sources as a kind of jazz session in which one person will offer a verse and another will begin to expound it, and then variations on a theme happen as the different people in that imagined community, the Chavraya, all offer their different verses. So it's not exactly like that, their different interpretations. It's not exactly like that in Hasidism, since it's usually one person speaking. On the other hand, the kind of improvisational dimension is key. There's a famous story that when they brought Rebbe Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl's collection of sermons to him just before he died to have it printed, he tore out from the volume every sermon that he remembered having given, because if he remembered it, it wasn't given al Ruach HaKodesh. It wasn't given by means of the Holy Spirit. It meant that it was something nice that he said. But a real Hasidic drasha is one that is totally in the zone. It's flow, as it were. And we have early attestations to this. The improv dimension is actually there in Solomon Maimon's description of having seen the Maggid of Mezrich go to work, where the Maggid of Mezrich invites a verse or a biblical verse or a rabbinic teaching from everyone who is assembled at the table. And then master teacher, as he was, he weaves them all together into his homily. And first of all, that's amazing. Second of all, although you hear the same thing about the Rosh Hashiva of a Lithuanian community who can give the shiur based on the page of Mikorot, the page of sources that someone else puts together.
Or a very talented YouTube rapper who can do the same, given a bunch of topics and immediately weave together a composition.
And so this kind of improvisational dimension is really key, and the Maggid of Mezrich does that. What I find particularly touching is that what Maimon says is particularly astounding, is that each person found in the interpretation of their verse, they found what they had come for. They found some sort of moment of spiritual illumination in that way that their verse was deployed. And here I think we have something else very deep about Hasidism, which that is it's situational. It's about my own encounter with the material and with the teacher at that moment. And so the living tradition comes to life through that encounter. So one good example of this that I often, I often come back to is the Baal Shem Tov's reading of Kol asher timsa yadcha la'asot bekochacha aseh ki ein be'she'ol da'at b'cheshbon. It's a verse from the book of Ecclesiastes, from the book of Kohelet, that suggests whatever you can do, you should do it with vim and with vigor, because we're all gonna go to hell and there's no real accounting there, which is one particular way. Yeah.
Well, it's a specific translation of the word Sheol, but yes, we will all descend to the Hades and, not return.
okay, whether it's hell in the Christian sense or hell in the Jewish sense of a place, it's a place that you fall down to, and it's not the place you want to be, and it's the place that you go in the afterlife, or perhaps even in this life if you're like Don Giovanni and you get dragged there while still alive, or I guess our version of Don Giovanni is Korach. In any event, the thrust of the way that is often understood, and the way that it's understood perhaps well within the context of Kohelet, is that there's an emphasis on this world, because the world to come is one in which we don't really understand and we don't know what's going to happen. So one lives with this world to the extent to which we can know it. And the beginning of Kohelet and the end of Kohelet seem to go in other directions. But the thrust of that book is a kind of this worldly affirmation in almost, I wouldn't say a nihilistic frame, but certainly in a complicated one. The Baal Shem Tov doesn't undercut that entirely, but he takes it in another way, and he says, Kol asher timsa yadcha la'asot bekochacha aseh, recalls to us the great sage Hanoch, the great sage Enoch, who all we know from the Hebrew Bible is that he walks with God and then he is no more. In the rabbinic imagination, we know a few more things about him, but in the extra rabbinic imagination, we know a lot more about him.
Right.
He goes up to heaven and he does this and he does that and he sees the entire cosmos, and there's the first book of Enoch and the second book of Enoch and the third book of Enoch.
Pseudepigrapha, is this correct?
It's part of the pseudepigrapha. It's part of the greater literatures of the ancient Near East that are apocalyptic, not in the sense of the world coming to an end, but apocalyptic in the sense of the revelation of new knowledge. And he is the hero of many of these. They're precursors to the kind of Merkava or Hechalot sources that you find in late antiquity. The version of that that's quoted in Hasidic sources is always not Enoch the stargazer, or Enoch the star traveler, but Enoch the Sandlar, Enoch the shoemaker, who brings together heaven and earth with each and every stitch. He, as it were, stitches together heaven and earth, the spiritual and the physical, matter and spirit. The way that the Baal Shem Tov deploys it is that he stitches together machshava and ma'aseh. He stitches together thought and action. And it's that transforms his actions into religious ones, or better, imbues them with a religious meaning that is transformative, cosmological, theurgic. It's also the unification of Kuchabrihu Ushchinte. It's the Blessed Holy One and the feminine aspect of the divine coming together. But Enoch is so special precisely because he transforms the ordinary into a moment of religious awakening. And so, Kol asher timsa yadcha la'asot bekochacha aseh means don't just do it with vim and with vigor because this world is the one that really matters. It is lean into that which you are doing and do it with the fullness of your presence, bringing mind and body together in that action. And this is the fasten your seatbelt moment when he says, Ki ein b'sheol da'at v'cheshbon, because if you don't do that, if you don't have da'at, awareness, and cheshbon, a sense of accounting of what you do, not of counting up your sins and counting up your merits, but accounting and reckoning for the way in which your actions hold infinite possibility. There is no such thing as a trivial deed. Then where do you live?
Right.
You live in Sheol.
Yes.
You live in a world of arbitrariness.
And you believe that homiletic, that particular teaching, to be central to the message of let's say early Hasidic thought?
First of all, I think it's central. First of all, I think it's a good example of the way in which the Baal Shem Tov doesn't exactly derail something, but also takes it in a different way. It's not
a very creative form of hermeneutics.
Good. And so you hear that and you're like, oh, wow, I've heard that verse every year on Sukkot for how many years? And I've never thought about it that way. My father-in-law and teacher, Rabbi Dr. Nehemiah Poland, always asks when he's reading a Hasidic source, if I stared at that pasuk, at that verse, how long would it take me to get to that way of understanding it? And the ones that he finds to be the most magnificent The Hasidic sources are the ones where you lock me in a room with that verse for a year and I'm still not going to get there. And I think that the Baal Shem Tov is a great example of, you lock me in a room with this verse for a year and I still don't think I would have seen it in exactly this way. And I think that it's a marvelous example of that kind of incandescent or almost illuminated exegesis that drives forward early Hasidism, where you take something you think you know, and you actually don't know. You take a commandment that you think you understood the meaning of, and here's another layer that can be added onto it. Or here's how it can be distilled down into a immediate and evocative way of thinking about it, which is at the one hand totally brilliant, and on the other hand simple, elegant, and invitational. And I have a sense that Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, who gives us this interpretation from the Baal Shem Tov, found it to be such because he quotes it in dozens of places. Either the Baal Shem Tov said it lots and lots and lots of times, or I have a feeling it was kind of like what we all have in our own experience, where a teacher will say something, and no matter what, for months or for years, we're doing, we're always going to find a way to work that thing that idea that we got from our teacher into that. And no matter what parsha the Rabbi Yaakov Yosef is writing about, he comes back to this time and time again. It seems to be one that really transformed his way of thinking about the world. And that makes sense because one of the only authentic letters that we have from the Baal Shem Tov is a letter to Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya saying, come on, how many times have we been over this? It's not about fasting. It's not about escaping the body. It's about transforming the body through joy.
Interesting. I'd like so again, there's so much to say on each of these things, but there's so many topics I want to cover, and we're not going to get through half of the things that I'd intended to, because we keep getting caught up in more and more fascinating things. I want to bring us back a little bit to the story you mentioned of the Hasidic master who, on his deathbed, wanted to get rid of all the sermons that he remembered giving, and because that leads us into a question about new conceptions of rabbinic or religious leadership within the early Hasidut, because I think that seems to be something that truly is different, truly is innovative, and would have aroused the ire of opponents of Hasidism. So it seems to me that a story like that seems to indicate that at least this particular Hasidic master, I forget which one it was, he had this notion that to give over a sermon required a kind of divine inspiration that may be translated in more secular terms as charisma, as something that could not really be planned in advance, could not really be taught, cannot really be inculcated. It is a gift imbued within a person, and that sort of radiates out at given moments. And I wonder, I mean, is that an accurate portrayal of what early Hasidic masters saw their own role to be? And in general, the question that I'm asking is, what are the significant differences? Because of course, religious leadership is something that had accompanied the Jewish religion from the beginning. What was qualitatively different about how Hasidic masters saw their own role as a religious leader?
I think the point that Rabbi Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl makes there about, I think as you put it, charisma is a good way of talking about it. The great improv master Viola Spolin talks about unmediated experience. I think it's very much that, the sort of pure and unmediated, immediate experience. It's very much that. Hasidism is, I think, indeed correctly known for highlighting a different kind of religious leadership, which had mostly been imaginative before then. By that I mean Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai of the Zohar is a kind of template for what will become Hasidic leadership. He's called the Botzina Kadisha. He is the great pillar upon which the world stands. He is the illuminated master. He's all these things. Isaac Luria actually lives that into existence in the 16th century Tzfat. But, it's a couple dozen people surrounding a couple of critical figures who give great ideas. But one of the things that distinguishes Hasidism from earlier Kabbalah is that it turns outward toward a kind of popular mysticism in the way that Sabbatianism had, but in a totally different way and with many different differences, many different distinctions between the religious movements. it is true that the charisma of early Hasidic leaders is really key. It's not their erudition, it's not their yichus, it's not their familial background, although they have both of those things in many cases. It is the fact that you didn't have to meet them twice in order to have the trajectory of your life changed. That's what's so interesting and exciting to so many people, at least I suspect. There are testaments from people who know these figures or who write about them that describe what it was like to be in their presence. And again, it is not simply that they know a lot of Talmud. It's not simply that they are that they come from the ancien regime of rabbinic aristocracy. It is that they are teachers who teach not only through ideas, but through the lived example of their own religious pathways. And this is why I think Hasidic stories are key to understanding the development of Hasidism, as well as a kind of retrospective Hasidic tales tell you about how Hasidic thinkers in the 19th century imagined their own beginnings in the 18th century, because most of the stories, almost all the stories that we have, come from either the first half of the 19th century or even more, the second half of the 19th century. Right. There are many distinctions between the Hasidim and their opponents within the traditional world of the rabbinic elites. Some have to do with ritual slaughter, some have to do with the nusach, or the rite, R-I-T-E, the liturgy that they use. Some have to do with the fact that they are forming their own prayer communities, not just because they're using a particular liturgy, but because they are splintering from the rest of the community, and they are changing certain kinds of ancestral customs, which in Ashkenaz and in Eastern Europe held tremendous weight and tremendous gravitas. It's worth noting that in many respects, or in most cases, the Hasidic thinkers inclined toward stringency, toward humrah, rather than to abrogation. And so in a certain sense, the Mitnagdim are caught between a rock and a hard place, because they know that something is different and new, and yet these people don't seem to be heretics in the classical sense. Sometimes Hasidic thinkers are pinned against the wall for their theological beliefs. In one of them, in one anti-Hasidic source, there is a declaration that they think that God is everywhere. They think that God is present in the words of prayer, and that they think that tzimtzum, this withdrawal, didn't really happen according to its simplistic meaning, that it's actually, they think that God is everywhere. And Taka, that's exactly what they believe. Right. They do. There is this kind of theological abyss in between them and the Mitnagdim. On the other hand, the idea
it's a very funny kind of attack. Sorry, there's a very funny kind of attack on the Hasidim of using classic Kabbalistic terminology and saying, you don't believe in this particular abstruse point of Kabbalistic doctrine in the way that it has been classically understood by certain particular interpreters, which is a difficult thing upon which to base an accusation of heresy. Let's put it that way.
Sure, but I mean, the culture of Lurianic theology and the culture of Lurianic ritual is very thick in Eastern Europe, and arguing over who are the inheritors of Lurianic Kabbalah is very much at sort of up for grabs here. And they do accuse each other of either misunderstanding Lurianic Kabbalah or misrepresenting it, or perhaps even better, doubting Lurianic Kabbalah. This is something that the Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi says about the Vilna Gaon, who he impugns for not being Lurianic enough, which is, not exactly, I think, a fair thing to say about the Vilna Gaon. But he also says that, he misunderstands dimensions of whether God did withdraw or didn't withdraw. So there is this dimension. However, JJ, your point about the destabilizing effect, destabilizing not in a pejorative sense, but destabilizing in the sense of what happens when a community moves from a kind of multifaceted or multifactorial system of authority in which custom, as well as erudition, as well as familial background, as well as this and that, bring authority. When it moves down to charisma, Max Weber, the great sociologist, shows us that that is a complicated thing for a society to undergo, and that really is a radical change. And certainly the idea that Hasidism brings to the table of this kind of illuminated religious leadership is a radical one. Indeed it is.
Fascinating. Okay, I'm going to have to sort of restrain myself from asking further on this, because one last question I wish to broach before the end, which goes something as follows. So we've been talking now for close to an hour on sort of intellectual facets of Hasidism and the underpinning of ideas. But there is a question mark hanging over the legitimacy of trying to analyze Hasidism through an analysis of its ideas. And I refer to a famous debate that took place during the 20th century between two titans of scholars two titanic scholars about Hasidism, namely Martin Buber and Gershom Scholem, which was exactly a debate on this question. For Gershom Scholem, who was a great historian of ideas, the way to analyze Hasidism as a movement, as a historical phenomenon, was to analyze its theology, its ideas, its texts, etc. Whereas Martin Buber took the position, something along the lines that no, that is actually an impoverished and methodologically unsound way of trying to analyze the Hasidic phenomenon, and he preferred a whole different toolkit, as it were, to try to understand this particular phenomenon. And I want to ask you, I mean, we've been talking about this now for an hour, is the analysis of ideas the correct or the primary or the best way to understand the phenomenon of Hasidut, or are there better, are there other ways which are necessary too?
It's certainly of critical importance to understand the ideas that undergird this religious phenomenon. On the other hand, understanding Hasidism as a social movement, a mass movement, a movement that is driven forward to a certain degree by ideas, but also by experiences and by new communal orientations and new communal structures, and as we just talked about, a new kind of leadership that is really what brings Hasidism aloft. The stories are key for understanding this. In so many respects, I find myself here, as elsewhere, rejecting a dichotomy in between understanding one or the other as the primary. I think that there are many ways in which ideas do transform the world, and there are many ways in which ideas are kind of retrojections into the past to justify changes as they are happening. There's this interesting debate that you find in the study of ritual, for example. Does the ritual come first, or does the idea come first? And I think oftentimes, certainly in the Jewish fabric, the ideas come second. The rituals come first, and we use those as ways of thinking. And so here too, the ideas are critical for understanding early Hasidism, late Hasidism, all kinds of Hasidism. If you go into a Hasidic community these days and ask them, what Hasidic books are you learning? Unless you're in Bratslav or unless you're in Chabad, you probably won't get a good answer. You'll understand that Hasidism is it's what David Katz called a total culture. It's one that has language and dress and other kinds of norms and huge numbers of cultural signifiers that give belonging. If Lukács says transcendental homelessness is the modern condition, and that's why all the modern novels are about that sense of dislocation, then Hasidism offers a totally different answer to what it means to be a person in the world in the 19th, 20th, 21st century, and I'd venture even in the 18th century. It's an answer to why religion, Elaine Pagel's question about why religion matters in the modern world. Hasidism offers an answer which is one in which the personal and the communal are interwoven one with the other. One in which love for God and love for other human beings are not at odds with one another. One in which obligation, whether that's halakha or other kinds of obligation, can sit together with a sense of vitality and spontaneity and excitement in the religious quest. One in which the idea that I am the only person who knows what God asks from me at any particular moment can sit together with commitment to a sense of lineage in my spiritual teachers. All of these can cohere together in a single heart. And to say that only the ideas matter or only the stories matter is to impoverish ourselves from the tremendous richness that Hasidism offers us even in the 21st century.
The modern phenomenon of Hasidism is something that you've written and edited a lot about, and that will have to be the topic for another conversation, because that could easily take another hour or 2 hours or however long we'd be willing to give it. But I think we're going to have to draw the curtain at this point, as fascinating as this has been. And I'm really very grateful to you, Professor Mayse, for coming and joining us on the podcast of Jewish Ideas, and we hope to speak to you again at some point in the future. This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.